When you take a stop and look and see crazy things in this black history, across the ocean and across the seas, now is the time to be free.
Hello and welcome to Afraka, a Blak Mestory, part 4, where we will continue to dig it down, trying to get behind the real story of how we got from our original position of magnificence, living naturally in a state of peace, love and relative prosperity, to our present position where even today we continue to struggle and strive for equal rights and justice in this modern world, which seems unable to accept that the African black person could also be capable of achieving developmental greatness. Before we continue to go through our Blak Mestory, I'd just like to quickly recap what we discussed in part 3. So here we have our umbrella tree, and as you can see highlighted in red, the 2 sections or chapters that we covered in part 3. The first one was independent Africa, going through to the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, where we discussed how the first major settlements developed in the northeastern portion of the continent around 10,000 years ago, which was followed by the mass cultural exchange known as the Bantu expansion that touched right across the whole continent, seeing the internet spread cultural advancements and practices. The development of the trans-Saharan trade route by the Kushites would become heavily used, particularly by Arab traders towards the latter part of the first millennium of the Common Era. The second section that we covered was Christianity during the first millennium, which I'd like to expand a little bit more on before we get into our next chapter on the Arab influence in Africa. As stated before, the relatively informal religion of Christianity was begun in Northeast Africa, namely Libya and Egypt, by the downtrodden peoples under Greco-Roman dominance. This underclass could be broken down into 3 groupings, the first 2 being the Jews and the Samaritans, who were mainly peasants and slaves, while the third was made up of the local African farmers. Looking back at the history of the Jews as it relates to the African experience, we have already uncovered inconsistencies between biblical history as it is told and the actual recorded histories. The recorded history shows us that the first 2 foreign groups to enter Africa did enter from the Near East, but neither of them were monolithic in their religious practices. The first, a Canaanite grouping who settled in a small area close to the border, established the 14th dynasty, operating with approval from the already established Egyptian rule of the 12th dynasty, causing it to become the new, slightly reduced 13th dynasty. The second of these groupings, the Hyksos, who became the 15th dynasty, were eventually chased out of the territory they held in northern Egypt by a pharaoh whose name was very similar to Moses, the prophet of the Exodus story. His name is Yamos I. Moses being a name that in the ancient Egyptian language relates to somebody who is a professor in the ancient mixed mysteries system, bearing no relation to any name of the Asiatic rulers of the 14th and 15th dynasty. This would suggest that Moses, in the true story from recorded history, was in fact at that time the chaser rather than the chased. As biblical history would have it, Judaism was established in Africa, and much that is within the telling of the Exodus event and their development afterwards in the land of Canaan is borrowed from the African culture that they had left behind. We mentioned in part 1 of this series how the Apis bull plays a part in the Exodus story, and that the lion, which we shouldn't forget is native to Africa, is an iconic figure within that faith, if we remember the lion of the tribe of Judah. Further Egyptian, Libyan and Kushite presence in the Near East over the following centuries would stabilize elements of the African culture in that region. This would later be interspersed with Persian culture and traditions after their invasion into the Near East, which also would spread into Africa. The presence of elements of Persian mythology throughout the Old Testament demonstrates that at least up until the rebuilding of the temple in the book of Haggai, biblical history is based on allegory and half-truths. By the time Alexander and the Greeks arrived into the territory, the Torah was firmly in place, along with the Jewish history that was now attached to it. The Samaritans were also an Asiatic people who had managed to avoid being dominated by the Jewish conquest during the period of the Maccabees, prior to the arrival of the Greeks. The indigenous farmers had largely been converted to the combined Asur-Apis faith imposed on them by the Ptolemaic Greeks with a deity called Serapis. This deity signified the union of the two ancient African cultures that the Greeks had found coexisting side by side. Seeking to take the credit for what for them was a newly discovered philosophy of togetherness within diversity, the Greeks caused this deity to take the form of themselves, being known as the Anointed One or Christus, bringing peace and harmony. The indigenous farmers had found themselves able to continue their worship towards this deity after so many centuries, as it didn't interfere too much with their acknowledgements towards their favoured deity. This idea of bringing two cultures together under one spiritual banner would prove to be the inspiration for bringing the three cultural groupings of Jew, Samaritan and indigenous farmers together under a new Christus by 50 CE. The intention was to create a unified force against Roman domination and oppression under Emperor Claudius. By the time the faith had arrived in Ethiopia 300 years later, anti-Roman sentiment was still strong amongst the faithful, and the Ethiopians' assessment of the scriptures would have differences to what would become Roman Christianity in accordance with the books of their newly authorized Bible under Constantine Caesar. This would see them invade into Nubia in search of the treasures believed to have been looted from the ancient Egyptian temples interpreting the stories of Moses to Solomon to have swung in that direction. This can be accepted as being the first instance of Ethiopianism being inserted into the multicultural spiritual movement of Christianity that was developed further in the north.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel.
Arab influence. The Arabian connection to Africa goes back further than the introduction of Islam. It goes back to the days of Punt and Axum, when they operated a form of colonialism over a big portion of the Arabian territory. With a big influx of Jews escaping persecution from the Roman occupation of their land in Palestine, the Arabs were able to drive the Ethiopians out by 300 of the Common Era, reducing their influence to just a few areas in southern Arabia, which is modern Yemen. The introduction of Christianity in Ethiopia would see it also touch into the Arabian territory, gaining some followership among them. In the early days of Christianity, the faith and the rituals associated around it were very much open to interpretation. The Ethiopians had already designed their own version, and the Romans also, something that by 600 of the Common Era had long seen an internal split between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West. Now, during the mid-7th century CE, the Arabs had completed their own design that would become known as the religion of Islam, setting out almost immediately on a mission of religious conquest in the Byzantine-controlled Near East. So, on the east coast of Africa, if we look on this map here, the Arabs arrived on familiar territory of Somalia and Djibouti, where Africa got its first introduction to Islam. This is indicated, if you look on the right, on the easternmost green dot, right on the east near Ethiopia, that's where Somalia and Djibouti are. So we just put a dot there just to indicate that. The Arab invasion of the Near East would continue into the Byzantine Empire, held territories of Egypt and Libya, from where they would start to use trade to spread their influence across the whole of North Africa. So we can see this indicated again by the arrows, the green arrows, which are pointing from the Near East into Africa, pointing towards Libya and also towards Sudan. The reason why we've got this arrow pointing in that direction towards Sudan is because attempts to invade south from Egypt into Sudan, which was an ally of the Byzantine Empire against the Arabs, were made, which were actually unsuccessful, and they would eventually come to a peace agreement between the two. We can also see the green dots indicating Arab presence during the 7th century on the north coast. As an increase in the Arab trade activity in Morocco along the Trans-Saharan trade route indicated here with the red arrow down to the Niger River drove several waves of migration due to the slave raids that were taking place. And those migrations, again, indicated in the blue and yellow arrows. There was significant movement of large numbers of Berber Maori into modern-day Mauritania, indicated with the blue arrow, with further migration from this location towards the Senegal River from the Africans who were based there in almost a domino effect response to the Maori movements, which is indicated with the yellow arrow. In the 8th century CE, on the north coast, Arab influence grew, leading to the Moor-led Islamic conquest from the west into Spain and Portugal. The emerging powerful empires further south in the west were able to sustain their power bases through their ability to trade with the Arabs operating on the trade routes. Meanwhile, on the east coast, Somalian and Arabian traders had begun making contacts in Tanzania, introducing their new faith alongside their well-practiced trading activities. Many of the Africans captured in the slave raids from this location were transported to Madagascar, where the Arabs had set up a base. By the 10th century CE, many of the great West African empires had begun converting to Islam, seeing trading opportunities as a big incentive for them to do so. This would encourage further waves of mass migration, first towards the south into modern Ghana and Togo, indicated on this map with the green arrows, and then into the next century towards the west into present-day Liberia and Sierra Leone, indicated here again with the yellow arrows. By 1500 CE, all of Africa, east to west, that wasn't south of Sahara and the Nilotic region, excluding the mountainous Ethiopia, was under Arab influence to varying degrees. From 1520 CE, the North Coast territories would begin changing into the hands of the Ottoman Turks, but the Islamic faith would remain in place in all of the territories where it had become the dominant faith.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel.
European contact. After the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the east, Europe had very limited, if any, contact at all with Africa, apart from with the Moors, who were operating under Arab leadership in control of parts of Spain and Portugal. Roman Catholic Europe's determination to take Palestine and the Holy City back from the Muslim Arabs brought a series of crusades. The Third Crusade, which took place in 1187, was the Axum King Blak Mestory's opportunity to introduce himself to the Christian brothers in support of what would be their failed bid to take Jerusalem. His view of Jerusalem during the battle inspired the construction of the famous religious site at Lalibela in Ethiopia. By the start of the 14th century CE, Ethiopia was surrounded by Muslim states, and fearing possible invasion, the king sent a party of delegates to Europe to seek assurances of support should their borders be attacked. The European leaders became confused, believing the Ethiopians to be subjects of a mythical white Christian priest and king called Prester John, who had gone to some far-off Eastern kingdom and successfully established a Christian society. They had believed the story to be connected to Thomas the Apostle, who, as tradition would have it, went to India to spread the gospel. During the mid-15th century, Portugal began sending ships down the west coast of Africa seeking payback for past Moor rule in their homeland. Stopping off at Mauritania, they hoped to be able to deal in gold, but would begin trading in slaves before continuing down the coast to reach the mouth of the Senegal River. Over the next few decades, the Portuguese would continue to edge their way down to the West African coast, getting as far as Angola by 1480. They set up various trading posts and cultivated trusting relations for various items including pepper, gold and slaves. By 1488, they had arrived all the way down to South Africa, stopping at what they called the Cape of Storms, uncertain of whether it would be possible to go any further and survive. Forming a solid relationship with the King of Congo, the Portuguese managed to persuade him to convert to the Christian faith in 1491, taking on the Christian name King João I of Congo. He went about having several churches constructed across his territory. The Portuguese explorers finally made it around the tip of southern Africa in 1498, arriving at Zanzibar and Kenya before finally heading east to India. They became massively involved in trafficking Africans for slavery in the Americas from their offshore island bases, both on the east and the west coast. Traders from other European countries started to arrive on the Guinea coast after the turn of the century, seeing a significant increase in slave trafficking operations. Still spoiling after the reconquest of Spain after centuries of Moor rule in their homeland, the Spanish invaded after a series of skirmishes into Algeria in 1509, slaughtering many. With Portugal now maintaining a naval presence in the Indian Ocean, Ethiopia once again made an appeal for support against growing aggression from Adol, which is modern-day Somalia, on the east coast around 1540. After successfully helping to repel the Ethiopians' Muslim neighbour, the Portuguese demanded that Ethiopia publicly profess its obedience to Rome, which was promptly refused, with the Ethiopians deciding to cut off all ties with Europe. It would remain in its self-imposed isolation for more than 250 years. The first half of the 17th century saw several European countries setting up posts along the west coast from Mauritania down to Gabon, dealing in gum, slaves, gold and ivory. The Dutch, who had been in a few conflicts with the Portuguese over the possession of territory in Congo and Angola, as well as in Brazil, turned their attention to setting up a post in South Africa at the Cape in 1652 to service shipping traffic going to and from India. Early into the 18th century CE, with Portuguese activity becoming more targeted on the African coast, Britain became a major player in the trafficking of Africans across the ocean for slavery in the Americas. The slave raiding inspired battles that took place often amongst neighboring villages solely for the purpose of servicing this market, stretched from Nigeria as deep inland as to reach the Central African Republic. Alauda Equiano, who was born and grown in Nigeria before being kidnapped at the age of 12 into slavery, said with regards to this subject in his book, Interesting Narrative of Alauda Equiano,
yeah, yeah,
By the end of the century, Britain took possession of a piece of land in present-day Sierra Leone, which they called the Province of Freedom. This is indicated on this diagram with the red dot on the west coast, just below the red arrow. The purpose of this was to use it to relocate the Black Poor of London, who were basically made up of Caribbean and American former slaves. An agreement was struck between bitter rivals, Britain and France, allowing the French to take control of land in the Senegal region, but the competitiveness between the powers would not cease with regards to Africa, as they sought to map out the inland regions still unknown to white men. In 1796, Scottish explorer Mungo Park became the first European to reach the Niger River. As you can see, indicated by the red arrow in between the blue dot for France's location of Senegal and the red dot for Britain's occupation or location in Sierra Leone. The red arrow pointing towards Niger River. He wrote a book titled Travels in the Interior Districts of Africa, relating what he had found on his expedition. Napoleon also sent a party of explorers to Syria and Egypt during their short-lived blockade of the trade routes to India, which was met with much frustration from the British. And that is indicated by the blue dot at the top of the map where Egypt is located. Amongst this party was Constantine de Volney, who was also a writer, and he wrote a book recording his observations called Travels Through Egypt and Syria. The Ottoman Empire would regain control of the territory in 1801, with support given by Britain in alliance with Ethiopia in 1805 to protect Egypt from any possible future French invasion. Britain's abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 would see them begin posting ships around the entrance to the Gulf of Guinea with the intention of intercepting slave ships carrying that inhumane cargo. They set up the British colony of Sierra Leone as a place where the Africans they freed from the arrested ships could be relocated. They were also able to reach an agreement with the Dutch to take over control of the Cape Colony in South Africa, whilst continuing their rivalry with France as they competed for influence in Madagascar. USA established its own version of the British Province of Freedom venture around 1820 with Liberia, territory claimed as a location for any of America's free black population wishing to return to Africa. In 1830, France invaded into the former Barbary nation of Algeria in what would be the first in a series of invasions at various sites along the north and west coast of Africa around the next couple of decades. Despite Britain's operations on the open seas against slave trafficking in the Gulf of Guinea and in the Indian Ocean, where they were based in Kenya, the Portuguese continued to practice out of Angola and Mozambique very much undisturbed well into the mid-19th century CE. During this period, European explorers and missionaries had begun venturing deeper inland in southern and central Africa, discovering Great Lakes mountains and falls previously unknown to any white man. After skirmishes over possession of small islands off the coast of Morocco, the Spanish invaded in 1859, defeating and possessing the remainder of the territory not being held by the French. Most European nations had abolished slavery by 1874 and abandoned their shipping operations in the Gulf of Guinea, leaving Britain as the only nation with bases off the coast of Ghana, which they called the Gold Coast. It is at this point that they claimed the coastal region of this territory as a British colony. Continuing to show a presence in the Indian Ocean, the British established Freetown in Kenya as a place where they could relocate Africans rescued from the slave trading being practiced mainly by Arabs and Indians in that region. The 1880s saw German leader Bismarck call a meeting of the European powers known as the Berlin Conference, where they would debate amongst themselves how the continent of Africa, where not already in European hands, should be carved up for their own nation's economic benefits, coining the phrase, the scramble for Africa. Germany, France, Britain and Belgium all claimed big chunks of previously uncharted land right across the continent, which with the forces of superior weaponry and one-sided diplomatic agreements, they were able to gradually take. As you can see here, the difference in the appearance of the map in terms of the dots compared to previous maps, what we have shown. A significant failure in this exercise in foreign domination of a land and its people was Italy's attempt to take Ethiopia, attacking that land from their east coast colony of Eritrea. It was a first example of a modern European nation being defeated in a war against an African nation. Somalia would be successful in fending off attempts by the British to annex its territory. Prior to the First Great War of the 20th century, Ethiopia, Liberia, and Somalia were the only African nations free from European colonialization. The Europeans' main purpose was the collection of African resources using systems of forced labor against the people and missionary work to pacify them. Many atrocities would be noted in the treatment of Africans under domination from the Europeans. Most notably in the Congo Free State early in the 20th century, where under the authority of the Belgian King Leopold II, many had had limbs cut off as a punishment for not delivering the required quantity of rubber. outbreak of the first of the two great wars of the 20th century would see all the territories held by Germany handed over to Britain, France and Belgium under League of Nations mandate. This, however, would not stop Britain from seeking to fulfill its perceived claim over Somalia in line with European agreements by beginning an aerial bombardment of the territory in 1920. This presumably encouraging Italy, which in addition to Eritrea had been in possession of Libya since 1912, to seek to progress its claim over Ethiopia by making a second attempt to annex it in the late 1930s. Being successful this time around, they would hold on to the territory there for a few years before being once again defeated by the Ethiopians, who were able to draw on significant support from Africans based in some of the Allied held colonies such as close neighbours DR Congo and Kenya. The end of the second great 20th century war would bring a United Nations push for African nations to be steered towards greater levels of freedom and ultimately independence, something that the Africans themselves across the continent have begun calling for with louder voices. To drive the point home, all of the territories formerly held by Germany and Italy had been given United Nations trustee status, meaning that they could only be held by an alternative European authority on the basis that they would work solidly towards achieving this. Undoubtedly, in response to this seemingly unfavourable approach, the colonists of South Africa, who had taken possession of Namibia from Germany after WW1, introduced what would become known as the apartheid system to support the stance of white supremacy in their society. A system of white minority rule as a step towards giving African nations greater autonomy and independence was being planned in some political circles in Britain. Although this system was introduced in Rhodesia and Nyasaland in 1953, the Africans of Uganda firmly rejected the idea, determined to keep the pressure for full independence. With similar groans of discontentment amongst Africans in its territories on the west, Britain began quickly to take steps towards independence in its own colonies, granting Nigeria semi-autonomous status in 1954. The second half of the 1950s saw all of the French-held territories granted semi-autonomous status, giving its people the right to vote for their own local government with limited powers. However, it seems that at this stage, the French were not happy with the prospect of having to grant full independence to these nations, and there is more than one example of leading agitators for independence being killed in plane explosions with suspected French Secret Service involvement.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel.
Belgium also showed itself to be against moving too quickly towards independence and had begun to see serious levels of unrest across its territories as a result. Having granted semi-autonomous elections in Burundi, which were won convincingly by the pro-independence party in 1961, the leader of that party, Rwagasore, was assassinated by a member of the opposition who confessed to there being involvement from Belgian authorities in his actions. Portuguese, who were even less eager to step towards independence, saw the formation of the MPLA, a nationalist movement against the colonial rule, in 1956. With the lack of progress in this direction, they would begin guerrilla-style attacks on colonial assets within their territory in 1961. Apartheid South Africa were without doubt the most determined of the colonial nations to ignore the United Nations directives on this issue, and as was the case all around the continent, black political groups were being formed locally against their system of rule. The ANC, formed in 1949, was the most prominent group organising protests and boycotts against South African government. Some dissatisfied members would form a breakaway group with a slightly more unapologetic approach than that practiced by the mild-mannered ANC, called the Pan-Africanist Congress. A demonstration organised by them in 1960 against the passbook system being imposed on black people was met with extreme brutality from the authorities, resulting in what would be known as the Sharpeville Massacre, with 80 demonstrators shot dead. Although the colonial ties were being loosened in most of Africa, with independence just around the corner, the Portuguese held territories, and those under white minority administrations were still a long way off where they needed to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel, rebel in the morning, rebel in the evening too. I'm a rebel, rebel. When you take a stop and look and see crazy things in this black history, across the ocean and across the seas, now is the time to be free. No commotion, I'm feeling the pain, I feel their emotion, the love and devotion, just like a root potion, 'cause I'm a rebel.